Until the next 02/27/2026, we are in the 5th year, and this is day 4 since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Welcome. I greet you to the Situation Report. Today's report focuses on changes on the front, particularly regarding the Ukrainian offensive. But we will also look at how Russia is currently putting pressure on the city of Konstantinivka, as well as other attacks or routes of the Flamingo cruise missiles, which have recently been able to successfully hit their targets in the Russian hinterland, and much more. Yes, the city of Konstantinivka is located in the east of the Ukrainian front. What we see here above all is that there has been no significant territorial gain, or actually no territorial gain at all, compared to the last update. This gray zone here is still about the same size as it is now. Fighting, if any, is taking place here on the southeastern outskirts of the city. But you know how it is. We are seeing more airstrikes here because the city has been under fire again for weeks. What you see there is not a targeted strike against military targets, but rather the gradual destruction of a city's infrastructure. Residential buildings, infrastructure, supply networks, everything is under constant fire. Artillery, glide bombs, drones, or as you can see, phosphorus munitions. This is what liberation by the brotherly people looks like. Remember that. Because the Russian principle, as always, is if you can't capture a city quickly enough, you simply destroy it. And when you talk again about collateral damage caused by their supposedly precise attacks, just remember, images like these are not collateral damage in the traditional sense. In occupied Luhansk, Ukrainian units from the unmanned system forces hit an oil depot. Even in the morning, a thick column of smoke continues to rise from the site. The fire is apparently not yet fully under control, and such facilities remain central for fuel supply and logistics in the rear area, and it's a heavy loss if they are lost, even if the damage here is limited. If limited, Lieutenant Colonel Hassan Tungwev was considered a recognized specialist within his division. Now he is dead. We fall in the night of the 24th to the 25th. February, as reported by the project Russian officers killed in Ukraine. Tungev was a commander, specifically the commander of an S-400 battalion, and that is exactly what makes the incident militarily relevant. If a drone strike doesn't just take out a single crew, but the battalion commander of a strategic air defense system, then that's not a random loss. That's an intervention at the leadership level. Why he was at the systems at the time of the attack is still unclear. With this, Russia is not only losing equipment, but also experience, training capital, and leadership capability. An S-400 unit is highly complex. Radar, fire control system, target assignment, coordination with higher-level structures. All of this, of course, depends on well-established procedures and experienced officers. Someone like that can't be replaced overnight. The system that is officially responsible for covering the airspace and protecting strategic objects, apparently couldn't protect either its own location or its commander. By the way, today's report will be a bit shorter than usual. The reason for this is that I have to go to Berlin right after this, since I will be visiting Ukraine, Berlin once again. As you know, we have donated quite a few vehicles there, or rather donated money to purchase vehicles. And it's only right to stop by from time to time and see what's happening, especially since that's the current state of things. There are always interesting things to gather, especially information, so I'll keep you updated as usual. In the meantime, let's take another look at the front, but this time at a different section. This is where the Ukrainian offensive is taking place, which so far remains limited to a local area. We can see that the main focus is on the fighting around Hill 161 here, 167 at this point, and the heavily fortified Hill 134. The main directions of attack are from Turnov, heading south toward the two hills. The main directions of attack are heading south, the main directions of attack toward the two hills. And here, the 95th is taking action. Paratrooper Brigade is still having an extremely hard time, and they have gotten a bit closer. I have moved this area here, the orange-gray zone, a bit closer to the village, because here, at the blue pin, there was an attack on a Ukrainian vehicle by Russian drones. It had already been abandoned and was destroyed afterwards, But that means the Ukrainians made it at least this far. But that means the Ukrainians made it up to this point, blocking the area for several hundred meters. The tape is already like this anyway. Of course it works in it. Here in Provilia, a Russian reconnaissance drone, an Orlan drone, was destroyed. Of course, it's not like they're somewhere nearby. They wouldn't be scouting their own positions. That would be absolutely stupid. We can assume from this that the Ukrainians are probably already positioned a bit better by now, or at least with several units in the orange area here. As I said, I'll only mark the 2 villages once I have clear proof they're actually on site and have held them for more than a few hours. Anything less isn't enough for me. Nevertheless, the fighting is still quite heavy, especially here in this area. But why attack there at all if the fighting is so tough, if it's so hard to advance, if the Russians have really dug in well here? What's the point of that? Well, if they were to capture Ribna, it would open the way for them to push further into the southeast, specifically here towards Uspanivka. That's a major objective. Because if they can hold and capture Uspanivka, they'll regain access to their defensive line here, which they lost in September, and which is also the goal of this offensive. That means reaching and holding this line, the old positions. At the same time, as I said, they're trying to do the same in this area here, but they're not really making any progress there either. Here, we're still at the level of Berezovy. Others have already marked the village as captured, but I haven't. There was also, right here on this road, let me zoom in a bit. So here at the eastern entrance to the village, there was a hit on a Ukrainian vehicle by a Russian drone. That doesn't mean the Russians are still in the village, but it does mean that the Ukrainians are definitely being targeted here as well, which of course makes further advances more difficult. I would say let's just check back in during the next situation report on Sunday. Maybe something will have changed by then. Now that the 5th year since the start of the full-scale invasion has begun, of course, as we've seen in the last reports, I actually covered almost every report, there were a lot of complaints or, well, rather sober analyses from Russian bloggers, especially from those who are very loyal to the Kremlin but have spoken out against it. The same goes for Butusov here. His main accusation is very simple. He was able to say that back in 2022, the Russians were simply able to attack very effectively and capture a lot of territory because the Ukrainians hardly defended at the beginning, and that only gradually changed over time. He claims most bridges weren't blown up. If Ukrainians had destroyed many, Russians wouldn't have advanced so far. He describes the 24th. He doesn't describe February 24, 2022 as a heroic defense, but rather as a series of open corridors. 5 bridges toward Crimea, toward the south, are still basically intact, and in the north there was also no systematic demolition. The result, Russian columns were able to cover 150 to 200 kilometers a day, a distance they would still wish for now. Now it's about 2 to 3 kilometers a day, if at all, and then only on one section of the front. Not because they were unstoppable, but simply because no one stopped them. Hostomel is a good example for him. The airborne operation was risky and could have been isolated, but reinforcements rolled in over intact transport routes. It was similar in the south. Kochavgadam, Railway Bridge, Bacherson, Antonivsky Bridge, strategic key points that, according to him, fell without adequate security. He argues from a military, not a political perspective. In his defense scenario with an expected invasion, prepared explosive charges are not just a detail, but rather a core component of real operational planning. That is the be-all and end-all of defense, especially when you have many bridges. Bottlenecks, rivers, dams, these are all natural delay points, as we've seen in situation reports over the past years. If they are destroyed in time, you force the enemy into tedious areas in bridge construction work, maintenance work. Even a single blown crossing can delay a mechanized formation by hours or days. And he points to a concrete example. A mined embankment passage stopped a Russian regiment for an entire day, without any artillery duel, without drones, without battles, just by a prepared barrier. According to Drone Bomber, citing Russian monitoring channels, this is actually a Russian channel that maps or estimates Ukrainian attacks, The reported flight path of 3 Flamingo cruise missiles can be reconstructed quite well. One thing stands out in particular. All 3 are said to have flown about 1,800 kilometers, and almost all of them took identical routes, meaning they followed the same paths. For the most part, they followed the Don River and its meanders. Of course, this corresponds to a deliberately chosen route. River corridors provide natural shielding against radar when flying at very low altitudes. The terrain, riverbanks, and bends in the river make early detection more difficult. As I said, the Flamingo is not a miracle weapon. It's a fairly large cruise missile that gives the Ukrainians the ability to deliver relatively large explosive charges deep into the Russian hinterland. But the thing is, as far as we've heard so far, it's relatively easy to detect by radar, which is why it obviously makes sense to send it into attack flying as low as possible. Militarily, that obviously makes sense. If reconnaissance or previous breakthroughs show where Russian air defenses are thinned out or poorly coordinated, you focus precisely on those kinds of targets. Routes? Based on the mapped route, you can clearly see in which sections there was apparently no dense radar or interceptor coverage. Long stretches along the Don seem simply not to have been effectively monitored, or at least not effectively defended. And it was exactly these gaps that were exploited. 3 systems, same route, close together. That's certainly no coincidence, but rather an indication of targeted analysis of enemy air defense dispositions and their systematic exploitation. Thanks to all subscribers, channel members, and the ALGOR crew, especially Lieutenant Colonel Rennecke, Sealer Dietrich, and Fredjo Meyerhofer. Please subscribe, like, comment, and see you in the next situation report.